Picture this. You're stuck in traffic, already running late for an important meeting. The person behind you starts honking aggressively, as if their horn could somehow magically clear the road ahead. Your jaw clenches, your heart rate spikes, and suddenly you're consumed by rage toward a complete stranger who has absolutely no impact on your actual life. Sound familiar? Now imagine if I told you that one of history's most brilliant minds figured out not just why this happens, but how to completely transcend it. Carl Jung, the revolutionary psychologist who mapped the depths of human consciousness, discovered something profound. The people who anger us the most are actually our greatest teachers, and the emotions they trigger in us reveal more about ourselves than we ever imagined. What if you could reach a state where no one could truly bother you, where criticism rolls off your back like water, where betrayal becomes simply information, and where even the most toxic people lose their power over your inner peace? This isn't about becoming emotionally numb or pretending problems don't exist. It's about achieving what Jung called psychological sovereignty, a state of inner mastery where your emotional responses become choices rather than automatic reactions. Jung spent his entire career studying why humans suffer, and he made a startling discovery. Most of our emotional pain doesn't come from what others do to us, but from what their actions reveal about the unresolved conflicts within ourselves. As he famously said, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. But here's where it gets interesting. Jung didn't just identify the problem, he provided a roadmap to transcendence. Through his work with thousands of patients and his own deep psychological exploration, he uncovered specific mechanisms that govern human emotional reactivity. More importantly, he discovered how to reprogram these mechanisms to achieve what he called individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are, independent of others' opinions, actions, or expectations. Today, we're going to dive deep into Jung's revolutionary insights and extract practical wisdom that you can apply immediately. You're going to learn why certain people trigger you so intensely, how to identify the hidden parts of yourself that create this reactivity, and most importantly, how to achieve a state of emotional freedom that most people never even know is possible. The person who cuts you off in traffic, the colleague who takes credit for your work, the family member who constantly criticizes you, they're all about to lose their power over you forever. Not because you'll learn to ignore them or fight back more effectively, but because you'll understand something so profound about the nature of human psychology that their actions will become completely irrelevant to your inner state. Let's start with Jung's most counterintuitive discovery. The people who bother us most are reflecting back aspects of ourselves that we refuse to acknowledge. This isn't some new age platitude about everyone being mirrors. This is hard psychological science based on Jung's observation of what he called projection. Jung observed that we don't see people as they truly are. We see them through the filter of our own unconscious mind. When someone exhibits a behavior that triggers intense anger or irritation in us, it's often because that behavior represents something we've rejected or suppressed within ourselves. He wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. Think about the last time someone really got under your skin. What exactly did they do? Were they arrogant, lazy, manipulative, dishonest?" Now here's the uncomfortable truth Jung discovered. If their behavior didn't somehow resonate with a repressed aspect of your own psyche, you wouldn't have such a strong emotional reaction to it. This is what Jung called the shadow, the parts of ourselves that we've deemed unacceptable and pushed into unconsciousness. The shadow contains not just our negative traits, but also positive qualities we've disowned. When we encounter someone who embodies these shadow aspects, our psyche reacts with the intensity of recognition, even though consciously we may be Completely unaware of this dynamic, Jung explained, "How can I be substantial if I do not cast a shadow? I must have a dark side also, if I am to be whole." The people who irritate us most are often showing us our own shadow material, the very qualities we need to integrate to become psychologically whole. But here's where Jung's insight becomes truly liberating. Once you understand that you're emotional, reactions are primarily about you rather than the other person, you gain tremendous power. Instead of being a victim of others' behavior, you become an investigator of your own psyche. Every person who bothers you becomes a teacher, showing you exactly where your psychological work needs to be done. Let's explore how this works in practice. Consider someone who really annoys you because they're always seeking attention. Your irritation might be revealing your own unacknowledged need for recognition that you've deemed selfish or inappropriate. Or perhaps someone's laziness triggers you because you've suppressed your own desire to relax and be spontaneous, forcing yourself to be constantly productive instead. Jung discovered that when we own these shadow aspects, when we acknowledge them as part of our complete human nature, they lose their power to trigger us in others. He said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." This process of making the unconscious conscious is what Jung called shadow integration. It's not about acting on every impulse or becoming someone you're not. It's about accepting the full spectrum of human nature within yourself, which paradoxically gives you more choice about how to express it. When you've integrated your shadow, something remarkable happens. People who used to push your buttons become simply people exhibiting human behaviors. Their actions don't penetrate your psychological defenses because you're no longer defending against those aspects of yourself. You can observe their behavior objectively, respond appropriately if necessary, but remain emotionally centered regardless of what they do. Jung also identified another crucial mechanism that keeps us trapped in reactivity, what he called complexes. These are emotionally charged psychological patterns that operate independently of our conscious will. When triggered, a complex can hijack our entire personality, causing us to react in ways that surprise even ourselves. Think about how certain people seem to activate a version of yourself that you don't even recognize. Maybe you're normally calm and reasonable, but around your mother-in-law, you become defensive and argumentative. Or perhaps you're typically confident, but in the presence of authority figures, you become submissive and anxious. These are complexes. In action, Jung observed, a complex can be really overcome only if it is lived out to the full. In other words, if we are to develop further, we have to draw to us and drink down to the very dregs what, because of our complexes, we have held at a distance. The key to transcending these automatic reactions is first becoming aware of them. Jung developed a technique called active imagination, where you consciously dialogue with these triggered parts of yourself. When you feel that familiar surge of anger or irritation, instead of immediately reacting, you pause and ask, what part of me is being activated right now? What is this reaction trying to tell me? This simple practice begins to create space between trigger and response. You start to notice the complex being activated without being completely overtaken by it. Over time, this awareness dissolves the complex's power over you. But Jung went even deeper. He realized that our reactivity to others often stems from what he called inferior functions, aspects of our personality that are underdeveloped and therefore sensitive to criticism or challenge. If you're naturally logical and analytical, you might be triggered by people who are overly emotional because emotion represents your inferior function. If you're naturally spontaneous and creative, you might be irritated by people who are rigid and systematic. The path to emotional freedom, according to Jung, involves developing these inferior functions rather than defending against them. As he put it, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. This means embracing all aspects of your personality, even those that feel foreign or uncomfortable. When you develop your inferior functions, you become psychologically complete. People can no longer trigger you by embodying qualities you lack because you've cultivated those qualities within yourself. You become like a master musician who can appreciate all forms of music because they understand the principles underlying each style. Jung also discovered that much of our reactivity comes from unconscious expectations we place on others. We expect people to behave according to our internal map of how the world should work, and when they violate these expectations, we become upset. But these expectations are often projections of our own psychological needs, rather than realistic assessments of what others can or should provide. He wrote, "The meeting point between psychology and metaphysics is in the unconscious. Our unconscious assumptions about how people should behave create most of our interpersonal suffering. When we make these assumptions conscious, we can choose whether to maintain them or let them go." This leads us to one of Jung's most profound insights. True emotional freedom comes not from controlling others, but from taking complete responsibility for your own psychological state. He said, "Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakens." This doesn't mean accepting abuse or failing to set boundaries. It means recognizing that your emotional response to any situation is ultimately your choice. Others can do what they do, but you decide what it means and how you respond. Jung developed what he called the transcendent function, the ability to hold opposing forces in tension without being torn apart by them. When someone treats you poorly, instead of immediately moving into victim mode or retaliation, you can hold both your hurt and your understanding, both your boundaries and your compassion. This creates a third option that transcends the usual fight or flight reactions. The transcendent function allows you to respond to difficult people from a place of psychological sovereignty rather than reactivity. You can acknowledge their behavior, protect yourself if necessary, and even feel disappointed or hurt without being controlled by those emotions. You become like a mountain that acknowledges the weather without being fundamentally disturbed by it. Jung also emphasized the importance of what he called psychological differentiation, the ability to separate your identity from your roles, relationships, and circumstances. Many people become reactive because their sense of self is so entangled with external validation that any perceived threat to their image feels like an attack on their very existence. When you're psychologically differentiated, you know who you are independent of what others think, say, or do. Criticism becomes information rather than assault. Betrayal becomes data about the other person rather than evidence of your unworthiness. Rejection becomes their choice rather than your failure. This differentiation doesn't happen overnight. It requires what Jung called the work, the ongoing process of self-examination and conscious development. But as you progress, you'll notice that fewer and fewer people have the power to disturb your inner peace. Jung identified 4 stages in this journey toward emotional sovereignty. First is unconscious reactivity, where you're completely at the mercy of your triggers and projections. Second is conscious reactivity, where you notice your reactions but still feel controlled by them. Third is conscious response, where you can choose how to respond even when triggered. Fourth is transcendent awareness, where most triggers lose their power entirely because you've integrated the psychological material they were designed to activate. The fourth stage is what Jung considered true psychological maturity. He described it as a state where the individual has been delivered from the sacred figures of his personal and tribal unconscious. You're no longer controlled by unconscious patterns, projections, or complexes. You can engage with difficult, people from a place of genuine choice rather than compulsion. This doesn't mean you become passive or indifferent. In fact, the opposite often happens. When you're not reactive, you can respond more effectively to genuinely problematic behavior. You can set boundaries without anger, confront issues without aggression, and protect yourself without hatred. Your responses become strategic rather than emotional, which makes them far more effective. Jung also discovered that our reactivity to others often stems from what he called participation mystique, an unconscious identification where we lose track of where we end and others begin. This is why family members can trigger us so intensely. We're psychologically fused with them in ways that make their behavior feel like direct attacks on our identity. Breaking this unconscious identification is crucial for emotional freedom. Jung wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. This complete self-acceptance creates such a solid psychological foundation that others' acceptance or rejection becomes irrelevant. When you've achieved this level of self-acceptance, something remarkable happens in your relationships. Because you're not desperate for approval or terrified of rejection, you can engage with others authentically. Paradoxically, this often leads to much better relationships because people sense your emotional independence and are drawn to it." Jung observed that people who are emotionally sovereign often become what he called containers for others' psychological material. Because they're not reactive, others feel safe to be vulnerable around them. They become natural healers and leaders, not through force or manipulation, but through their psychological stability. But perhaps Jung's most profound insight was that achieving emotional sovereignty isn't just about personal peace, it's about fulfilling your unique purpose in life. He believed that each person has what he called a personal myth, a unique contribution they're meant to make to the world. But this contribution can only emerge when you're free from the psychological bondage of reactivity. When you're constantly triggered by others, your energy goes into defending, attacking, or managing your emotional reactions. There's little left for creating, contributing, or becoming who you're truly meant to be. Emotional sovereignty frees up tremendous psychological energy that can then be channeled into meaningful pursuits. Jung said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But you can't become who you truly are while you're psychologically enslaved to others' opinions, actions, or expectations. Emotional freedom is therefore not just a luxury. It's a necessity for anyone who wants to live an authentic and meaningful life." So how do you practically apply Jung's insights? Start by paying attention to your emotional reactions throughout the day. When someone irritates you, instead of immediately judging them or defending yourself, ask, "What is this reaction teaching me about myself? What aspect of my own psyche is being activated?" Keep a trigger journal where you note what behaviors bother you most and look for patterns. Are you consistently triggered by arrogance, dishonesty, neediness, laziness? Each pattern points to shadow material or undeveloped aspects of your personality that need attention. Practice what Jung called holding the tension of opposites. When someone treats you poorly, try to hold both your natural hurt or anger and a broader perspective that sees their behavior as information about their psychological state rather than ultimate truth about you. Work on developing your inferior functions. If you're naturally intellectual, cultivate your emotional intelligence. If you're naturally emotional, develop your analytical abilities. If you're naturally introverted, practice engaging socially. If you're naturally extroverted, cultivate solitude and reflection. Most importantly, take complete responsibility for your emotional state. This doesn't mean blaming yourself for others' behavior, but recognizing that your response to any situation is ultimately your choice. As Jung put it, "I am not what happened to me, I am what I choose to become." The journey toward emotional sovereignty is not easy, but it's the most worthwhile work you can do. It transforms not just your relationship with difficult people, but your entire experience of being human. You move from being a victim of circumstances to being the author of your experience. When you've mastered Jung's principles, you'll find that the people who once had the power to ruin your day become simply people exhibiting human behaviors. Their actions won't penetrate your psychological defenses because you won't need to defend against aspects of human nature you've already integrated within yourself. You'll still feel emotions, perhaps even more deeply than before, but they won't control you. You'll still set boundaries and protect yourself, but from a place of strength rather than reactivity. You'll still care about others, but your caring won't be conditional on their behavior toward you. This is the gift Jung offers us, the possibility of true psychological freedom. Not freedom from life's challenges, but freedom in how we meet those challenges. Not freedom from difficult people, but freedom from being controlled by them. Not freedom from emotion, but freedom to choose our emotional responses. The person who cuts you off in traffic is just someone in a hurry. The colleague who takes credit for your work is just someone struggling with their own insecurities. The family member who constantly criticizes you is just someone who never learned healthier ways to express love or concern. When you see people this clearly, without the distortion of projection, complexes, or unconscious expectations, they lose their power to disturb your peace. You become psychologically sovereign, master of your own inner domain, free to respond to life from a place of choice rather than compulsion. This is Jung's ultimate gift to humanity, the knowledge that emotional freedom is not only possible but achievable through understanding the depths of our own psyche. The path is challenging, but the destination, a life free from the psychological tyranny of others, is worth every step of the journey. Remember Jung's words. Your vision becomes clear when you look into your heart. Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakens. The key to never being bothered by anyone lies not in changing others, but in awakening to the fullness of who you are. And that awakening, once achieved, can never be taken away.